I want to talk a little bit about why it's now possible to buy and sell things that you once couldn't buy and sell, why it's possible for things and entities in the private sector to do things that once only state agencies could do, and what that means for intelligence. And I'll endeavor to do it without stepping too much on Ulrika's toes, who will talk about the military aspects of this in a moment as well. And I want to begin with this, which is a satellite image, as you'll be able to see. And a few months ago, I was dealing with the aftermath, writing about it for The Economist, of the Israel-Iran missile exchange. As you will recall, Iran fired a barrage of missiles at Israel, giving them plenty of warning, and most were shot down, as we heard earlier on. And then Israel struck back, and it struck back in a very interesting fashion. It struck back at a air defense facility in the country's region that was not far away from the Natanz military complex in Iran, a bit of a distance, but not too far away. And someone reached out to me, who I know, and said, there's something interesting to show you. And they said, here's a high-resolution picture of the site that was struck. And I said, okay, tell me what I'm seeing, because that's just a bunch of stuff, and I have no idea what that is. And they said, well, that's the point that they hit, and you can see the scorch marks around the site. You can see the black charring and what's happened on the ground. And they said, what's interesting is there is a radar over there. I said, oh, that's interesting. So they fixed it. They put that back. And he said, no, the radar was blown up and destroyed. That's a different radar that they put there. And I said, oh, so they've repaired the site. It's working again. And he said, no, that radar has nothing to do with that site. That doesn't, does this work? That doesn't do anything. That's just to make it look like there's a radar at that site. It's a completely different radar for the missile defense battery that was at this position. And what the Iranians had done is replace it very fast to make it look as though they had brushed off this Israeli strike. I think that's fascinating for all sorts of reasons. It's fascinating because of the importance of ritual, of image, of narrative in deterrence, in warfare, in these sort of skirmishes. It's interesting also because of our ability to expose a ruse like this using unclassified public information available in the open source at high resolution. Now, open source and public doesn't mean democratized entirely. I could give this to all of you. I suspect pretty much all of you, maybe you're a military expert, some other military experts in the audience who have experience of analyzing imagery could tell us something about this, but most of us couldn't. But you need a degree of expertise. But the remarkable thing is that this could be done at all, because in the 1990s, in fact, for most of the Cold War, America relied very heavily on satellite images. It did not share those images, even with most of its allies, or it did so very rarely beyond the Five Eyes. It did not even acknowledge it had some kinds of satellites until the 1990s, such as radio frequency satellites that could pick up radio emissions from the ground. The existence of these things was classified, and here we are, within days of a strike, getting this. Now, that is a facet of a bigger issue. This shows an investigation done by the New York Times 5 years ago, not even new, this isn't cutting edge. This was location data collected by advertising brokers on apps, collected from mobile phone apps that you all use, weather applications, other apps, traded and sold by data brokers. What they had done here is de-anonymize some of this, or semi-de-anonymize it, to track down the movements of a Secret Service officer accompanying then President Trump. And this was the tip of the iceberg. The investigation was great. What's the connection between these two things? Well, at the top level, it's that you can track an individual, their location, at a granular level that 30 years ago, even a state intelligence agency might have struggled to do because people were not carrying trackers on them, and now they are. The thing that unites these is the microprocessor revolution that has simultaneously made satellite, commercial satellite, Earth observation satellites possible by shrinking sensors, cost, size, effectiveness, efficiency, and the same revolution means that I haven't got my phone, but in your pockets are phones that are full with sensors, not just optical sensors, but sound sensors, light sensors, accelerometers, LiDAR sensors to unlock the phone on your face, that were exquisite pieces of technology 25 years ago and are now forming little intelligence machines in our pocket. So what are the implications of this? Well, this is one example of Bellingcat's investigation into GRU officers using their phone data, which is, by the way, not an example of OSINT or open source, because I can't just download Russian phone location data, but I can buy it on the dark web through shady people who will sell it to me. And by doing so, Bellingcat very famously exposed not just the people who poisoned Sergei Skripal in Salisbury in 2018, but also, in this case, I think this is the case of, if I remember correctly, those tasked with poisoning a Bulgarian arms dealer, the same GRU 29155 squad that's since been renamed, operating in Bulgaria. And so what we have is that kind of remarkable private sector counterintelligence capability using not necessarily open sources, but what we call PAI, publicly available information, or CAI, commercially available information. So this is another example I like. This is a company, one of the many threat intelligence or cybersecurity companies that in 2021 saw why are Taiwanese surveillance cameras talking to the power grid in India? That's not a normal thing. You know, why are they doing that? That's weird. And what was happening was it was a Chinese intrusion into the Indian power grid, parts of, I think they call it load distribution centers, critical parts, routed through surveillance cameras, internet protocol, internet-connected cameras in Taiwan and South Korea. And the company in question, Recorded Future, who I think the founder is a Swede, Christopher Ahlberg, knew this because they were scanning the entire internet for what we call, what cyber types call command and control, C2 nodes, which are the stepping stones for suspicious traffics, the way to disguise your cyber attack into somewhere you're trying to get to. And they were scanning the entire internet for these things and therefore could find anomalous nodes and said, that is weird, that shouldn't be happening. And when you dig into it, you can see here, they can look at the IP addresses being used for these attacks. They can see data being transferred from redacted, because they don't want to give away all the secrets, from these servers out of the Indian power grid in preparation for, presumably, a degree of wartime sabotage. This is a public page from their report that they published on the issue. It's a great study. And it's such an interesting case study, but it's just another one of those things that you can now do. And a private sector firm could do that. Could a state intelligence agency do it? Yeah. Does it have time to scan everything all the time, looking for every bit of suspicious traffic? No. All intelligence agencies are resource limited. They have to prioritize. They focus on what matters, and they devote personnel accordingly. So what are the implications of this? Well, okay, let me start with the positives, and we'll get onto this in a second. Positives are we can expose stuff that was harder to expose in the past. Intelligence agencies can ease the load on themselves by having the private sector do some of this. In fact, this is relevant because this is an example of Mandiant, or Google Threat Intelligence, identifying Russian, Sandworm is a GRU, Russian military intelligence, conducting cyber sabotage on Ukraine's power grid. Now, the Mandiant, I'm pretty sure, I can't say this for sure, have better knowledge of some Russian cyber activities in Ukraine than Western signals intelligence agencies do, because they are on the network. They are on the network, inside. And similarly here is Microsoft publishing details of Chinese intrusions into Guam's communication network as part of a big sabotage effort. So they can share the load. They can share things with the public and allies they could not share previously. Obvious example being big, shiny pictures of Russian troops gathered on Ukraine's border in late 2021, or previously that were simply too classified to share, right? But what's the flip side of this? Well, it's that there's a... Oh, sorry. And so here's the challenge, right? This is clearly a huge opportunity. This is from a report that was published by two intelligence and defense insiders in the UK for the Alan Turing Institute last year. I have a bit of a beef. I have a bit of a disagreement with this, though. And problem one. You have a load of open source data. So let's say you've got all the Russian phone records and, passport records like Bellingcat used, and all the graduation photos from the Russian military academies and all that stuff. And then you've got some secret stuff. Maybe you have all the phone data for a Russian intelligence officer, and you want to integrate these two. That's actually much harder than it sounds. It's much, much harder than it sounds. First of all, what people often don't understand is, when you ask a question of unclassified data, sometimes the question that you ask is classified. If you want to ask, did this intelligence officer go between these two countries on this date? You've immediately revealed something about your interests, your question, your prior knowledge, the gaps in your knowledge. So you can't just ask that of a big open source unclassified computer server. So nor can you pull the entire corpus of the internet up into your classified servers, because classified computing power, secret compute, is a very scarce commodity in government. It's expensive, it's difficult, it's protected. So you can't just shove all of it into your secret cloud and do that. There is a big division in the intelligence world between what they call the high side and the low side. The high side is the classified stuff. The low side is unclassified stuff. Making these two things talk to each other is incredibly difficult, to do that in a secure way. And government around the world, intelligence agencies around the world, I think, are still trying to address the question of how do you integrate these two things? How do you do the OSINT, but also the secret stuff? And how do you use the secret stuff to inform the questions that you ask of the open source? I can't just go to Airbus or Maxar or Planet or a commercial satellite company and say, give me your photos of that location in Russia, because I know from my secret human source that there is a wonderful secret Russian missile launcher there, because I have just given up some really valuable information by asking that question. So this is a challenge of architecture, and it's a challenge of institutions. It isn't just a challenge that stops at having all the cool stuff out there. And then there are additional problems to do with privacy, law, and ethics. This is a quote from a very good report published last year, a panel for the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, on what this profusion of PAI, public available information, means. And they said, yes, the intelligence agencies can do fantastic things. Yes, they can have access to things they previously wouldn't. And yes, they can share it at an unclassified level with us to expose malfeasance by others in the ways they couldn't previously. But this raises really significant issues. Some of them are legal. The fact is, in the UK, in the US, and I imagine in a number of other countries, like-minded democracies, it is easier for private firms to collect what we would call bulk personal data sets. That is, for example, let's say, all that vast location data at the granular level, or health records or something. It is easier for a private firm to buy them and acquire them and store them than it is for a secret agency, for some pretty good reasons to do with the powers of the state. But that presents some problems as well. How do you get the state to do these things when the laws they operate under for bulk surveillance and for warrants can be quite stringent? When your adversaries, like China, are hoovering up these data sets by the bucket load. Presumably not just with the hope of doing the same things we're doing, catching spies and counterintelligence, but also with the aim of understanding Western populations for influence operations and for all manner of other purposes. And the last point to raise is that this also raises fundamental questions about whether we in the Western publics understand the degree to which we are hemorrhaging secrets as societies into the digital world. We're all carrying small intelligence machines in our pocket. We're all releasing information about our location, about our activities, in many cases DNA in home testing kits, our health data through apps. And those are all vital intelligence commodities that are being released and are being brought, to come back to our overarching theme, that are being bought and sold and traded on the market in an intelligence marketplace. And I think my hypothesis, and this is just a hypothesis, is that just as in 2013, a crisis came when the Snowden revelations revealed the nature of American and Five Eyes bulk surveillance, not because it was all egregious or wrong or outrageous, or something that no one else was doing, but because it wasn't understood and the scale and intrusiveness and potency of it wasn't understood, so too is there the risk that we're at a moment where the gap between what is possible through publicly available information in the intelligence world and public understanding and consent for those sorts of operations is wide and growing. And there is the risk, I think, of the same kind of backlash or breakdown of trust that we saw 11 years ago in the aftermath of Snowden. So I'll stop there, and thanks very much.
You have a lot of government agencies now prohibiting their personnel from having TikTok on their phones. Against this background, how much of a difference does that make?
I think that it's. I think that it makes very little difference, because I think that the people whose phones and data you're protecting the most are those least likely to have TikTok on their phones. They're least likely to have TikTok installed on the phones they're using for anything relevant. And in the grand scheme of things, that hemorrhaging of data that I described, whilst I do think TikTok presents a security risk and an information risk, and it's an app, you know, we understand the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and technology companies and all of that. If the aim is to identify the movements and the personal activities and the browsing of individuals of concern, that data is available in bucket loads from a variety of other sources and outlets than TikTok alone. And if we're talking about Chinese vectors of intelligence, of information, of data in Western societies, I'm in some ways less concerned about TikTok than I am about the fact that the kind of wireless and cellular modules inside electric vehicles and inside all manner of other goods are ubiquitous, well beyond one single, social media app.
Okay, thank you very much.